with that commitment to enabling the channel to move up the value chain to deliver higher value at lower cost. We saw an opportunity for that, certainly the office equipment channel, to move into broader IT services on a similar basis to managed print, where you have the assets on contract, you're looking at usage billing, you're looking to service those assets remotely, and if and where necessary, provide consumables automation predictively and intelligently as well. We really wanted to outrun that commoditization by enabling those partners to deliver broader IT solutions more profitably and break into that broader sector. And the volume channel, quite interestingly, have now started to add remote service management to printer devices under a hybrid office or modern workplace contract that has everything on it: hardware, software, professional services, training, both branded solutions together with native services. And really, our role is to aggregate all of that. The integration of technology into that e-commerce platform from distribution into the funders, multiple funders for the enablement of the automation of contracting. That's really enabled us to help the channel to move more deeply into putting everything on contract, which is more profitable for them, more affordable from an end user perspective. Even today, we're looking at moving the IT industry, and have already moved the IT industry from a 5% penetration rate in terms of contracted assets to a 35% conversion rate through the power of the automation and the fact that it's multi-brand and it can aggregate anything from a blended basket of products at the best possible rate.
Hello and welcome to In the Spotlight with Quocirca, the definitive podcast on digital disruption in the print industry. I'm Luella Fernandez, Director of Quocirca, and today I'm joined by Colin Bosher, Group CEO of EKM. Today we'll be discussing as a service in the print industry and hearing about EKM's focus on service automation, IT services and remote monitoring. So welcome, Colin. It's great to have you here today.
Hello, good to see you again, Luella. Thank you.
So I know you've got a lot of experience in the print industry. So could you maybe start by telling us a bit about your career history and your current role today?
Yeah, of course. I'll go before the print piece just to give a bit of backdrop, because some of that's relevant to what we're doing today. So I began in corporate fleet contract hire back in the late 80s. So buying and leasing back large corporate fleets, releasing the cash from those fleets into those businesses, and then managing those assets ongoing, which is something similar to what we're doing today. And then I went into technology distribution with the Misys Group in the late 80s. I worked for those guys for a few years as a distributor of printer technology into the reseller channel. So right from the outset, working with the channel, enabling the channel with higher value solutions. We typically distributed mainly Fujitsu product at the time. And it was as far back as Dot Matrix, not quite as far back as Daisy Wheel, but that's where we began, and that's where I first came into the technology sector. After a few years of that, began to move into the manufacturer realm, so worked with the big Japanese conglomerate Kyocera Meter. They were a Kyocera at the time, and you may recall they had a brand called Ecosys. So we were looking at total cost of ownership back in the early 90s, and carbon footprint reduction really before anybody else was. And that was really the precursor to managed print, where in sort of mid-90s, well, still in 93, I started to work with companies like Computer Center and others, delivering Print Plan, which was the first version of a managed print solution, really. Working also with companies like Icon, who then later became Ricoh. Prior to moving to HP, when you're selling against HP for many years and you realize it's a tough game, if you can't beat them, join them. So I joined HP in the UK as the first hard copy specialist in 1996, and moved on to some of the more challenging accounts and converted them, whilst introducing something called Digital Sender, which you may recall, which was the first very powerful scanning solution. It could integrate with 100,000 address book users, had a Unix operating system. It looked like an expensive fax, but it was a lot more than that. I went on to become the global program manager for that product out of Italy, out of Bergamo. whilst at the same time working with the strategic win team, which was an ISV partnership operation with HP, a global one, looking at e-services, which are surprisingly similar to managed print in many ways, but also similar to as a service as it is today. Again, ahead of its time. Prior to then running the procurement program for B2B for HP, which was where I started to think about where the industry was going, managed print, enabling the channel. And at the end of 2000, decided, or the end of 99, decided to create EKM and the value proposition around the consolidation of printing, fax, copy, scan, the enablement of that, TCO cost reduction. We were the first to introduce the first ISV to develop technology for total cost of ownership, audit assessment design, as you may recall. We then went on to develop service management platforms, having a very deep understanding of those platforms, working very closely, again, with companies like Computer Center, SEC, Downward, and others from 2000 to 2012, often seconding into those organizations to understand exactly what it was they were delivering, to ensure that we had a detailed specification for the software to actually deliver what was required from a service automation perspective, as opposed to just developing in the dark, and certainly without copying any other platform. We've never done that. So created ATCO in 2016. EKM became an ATCO company. Firstly, when was that? July 2018, that transaction took place. We did that because we wanted to work with the distribution channel, which could scale much more than we ever could alone, whilst never ever competing with channel partners. That's something we don't do, we will never do, and distribution is unlikely to do as well. So that's where we felt we belonged, to make our solutions more repeatable and scalable, integrating multiple systems and processes together. And now we're at a point of ongoing market research, combined with very practical solution development and very relentless client-centric innovation, which is an ongoing work in progress, as I'm sure you can imagine.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting career history, actually. And I think, you know, it's interesting you mentioned the Kia Zero and the carbon footprint calculator, because that's, you know, as you say, a precursor to some of the MPS contracts, I guess, we saw in the early days. And actually that's becoming more of a requirement now going forward. So given your experience in the industry, what are your views on where the industry is now in terms of MPS? Because I know you talk a lot about moving towards more as device as a service. And yeah, I'm just curious as to where you are now in terms of that strategy for EKM.
What was managed print of the late 90s, and I think really running up to the financial crisis in 2008, where it got severely impacted by channel dynamics and financial pressures. There was a lot of competition, direct and indirect engagements, which drove down the price and commoditized office equipment and the click price to a large degree. I don't think really the industry recovered from that. And then, of course, we've subsequently had the pandemic. So again, with that commitment to enabling the channel to move up the value chain, to deliver higher value at lower cost, we saw an opportunity for that, certainly the office equipment channel, to move into broader IT services on a similar basis to managed print, where you have the assets on contract, you're looking at usage billing, you're looking to service those assets remotely, and if and when necessary, provide consumables automation predictively and intelligently as well. Gluing all of that together looked like, rather than a $100 billion industry opportunity, we're looking now at a $3 trillion industry. Just at the time where subscription started to become quite popular. Cloud computing is another driver that aligns to charging on a subscription usage basis, and so that's really where we began to look at extending what we were doing in managed print as it became higher volume, lower value, and therefore with a need to be highly automated to drive down the operational cost to sustain a level of profitability for the channel and for our manufacturer partners as well. That we really wanted to outrun that commoditization by enabling those partners to deliver broader IT solutions more profitably and break into that broader sector. And the volume channel, quite interestingly, have now started to add remote service management to printer devices under a hybrid office or modern workplace contract that has everything on it: hardware, software, professional services, training, both branded solutions together with native services. And really our role is to aggregate all of that. So really it's, for me, a natural extension to what we were doing already. And if you look at the trajectory, it was always bound to be the case that what we were doing in the managed print market was going to extend to other technology assets as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you talk about how EKM is helping the channel move up that value chain. So can you talk a bit about, and you talk about the volume side of the channel as well. So can you talk a bit about how EKM for technology is supporting those kind of two areas in terms of the channel partners moving up the value chain, but also the volume channel as well?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we still have a very active and growing business in what was, I believe is somewhat redundant now in terms of being termed MPS, because it's that managed service capability is extending to other assets, and the need to consolidate that as a one-stop shop is really that seems to be where it's all heading. E-commerce and digital transformation is also accelerating that. So we're spending a lot of time initially integrating high volume distribution because it's the aggregation point of the industry, of the technology industry. Typically, it's only really in office equipment and some other vertical niche areas where manufacturers don't typically leverage multi-tier distribution. Most of the IT industry is aggregated through that model. So the ability to pull together all of the components, all of the software, the services, the training, the enablement, the configuration, the drop ship if necessary, really leveraging that model was something that we were looking to do because it had such a huge amount of reach compared with what we could do alone. And to be honest with you, over a 15-year plus period, I think we did pretty well in terms of our impact on the industry, but nowhere near what we could have achieved if we'd had distribution behind us across that volume channel. So the integration of technology into that e-commerce platform from distribution into the funders, multiple funders for the enablement of the automation of contracting, that's really enabled us to help the channel to move more deeply into putting everything on contract, which is more profitable for them, more affordable from an end user perspective. And even today, we're looking at moving the IT industry and have already moved the IT industry from a 5% penetration rate in terms of contracted assets to a 35% conversion rate through the power of the automation and the fact that it's multi-brand and it can aggregate anything from a blended basket of products at the best possible rate. And some of those rates have exceptional residual value in, so they offset some of the other costs and enable that channel to be more competitive. I believe that we've done a pretty good job of getting to market before anybody else on pulling all of that together to make it super simple, so it's scalable, whilst at the same time dealing with the inherent complexities of aggregating all of that into one subscription on behalf of that volume channel. That was really the challenge. We've done that. We're now finding that the remote service automation requirement is now aligning very closely to subscription and as a service. Again, it's incredibly multi-brand, and we're already activating the e-commerce, the native e-commerce platforms of the larger suppliers, the larger corporate resellers and systems integrators, and increasingly enabling the volume channel to have a combined solution, a click to buy and a click to subscribe solution at relatively low cost, so that they can also move that value much closer to their customer, whilst increasing their profitability and moving in the direction of consumption computing. Is that, for me, for the office equipment sector, as the new office automation of the 70s, which is now modern workplace of this era. And for the volume channel, enabling them to move away from commoditization, putting everything on contract, and having a much more sustainable business. And that's what our role really is, to continually evolve that and adjust according to the feedback we get market dynamics, and a bit of predictability on where things are heading, which we're pretty good at.
Yes, and I think, really that you sort of talk about distribution, service management, remote monitoring, and e-commerce there. And I think, they've all had sort of massive changes over the past few years as well in terms of how businesses are procuring their technology. So I'm just interested because I know the acquisition by Techdata was fairly recent. Can you talk a bit about the impact on that on your company's strategy?
Yeah, I mean, just to be really super clear, we're a wholly owned subsidiary. We've been an investment with Techdata Group for, since 2018. And our business has grown significantly since then, mostly, I think, down to the making our technology available to a much broader industry, white labeling our technology. We typically OEM brand with several manufacturers our products and our platforms. So often we're delivering solutions and services without anybody really knowing that we're under the hood. So the introduction of that technology to the right people in the channel who can take advantage of that has had a very positive impact on our business. The acquisition, the full acquisition, is really to align with close to $1 billion of investment into digital transformation and e-commerce, and digital commerce and subscription. All of these things are really coming together. They need a significant amount of investment to get them to work properly in the market. They need a lot of testing. We call it UAT, user acceptance testing of platforms before they actually get out into the wild. And as a consequence, and because of the higher levels of profitability and the affordability factor, certainly into certain very capital expenditure sensitive parts of the market, we've seen quite a strong demand for what we're doing, a stronger demand for our managed print solutions too, especially in light of some of the accreditations we have around data security and integrity. We take that very seriously, and so we're committed to, obviously GDPR, Cyber Essentials, those kind of accreditations, which obviously make the channel very comfortable, whilst at the same time, clearly the role of distribution is pretty familiar to the channel too, where again, because distribution never engages with an end user on a direct basis, there's a high degree of trust between the channel and distribution, which bodes well for our business.
Yeah, and I think you just mentioned there the point around data integrity, and I think there's always, the role of the channel is changing in the print industry, and they're having to evolve. And like you talked about commoditization, it's not just about shipping boxes; it's that kind of value on top of that, whether it's solutions and services. But in terms of some vendors more likely to go direct, or perhaps use a platform like yours to kind of be the intermediary. What really is the situation in terms of data and what data you do hold?
In terms of data, we don't typically hold any client sensitive data in any of our platforms, either in our remote service automation platform, which is aligned mostly to MPS at the moment. Mm-hmm. It will extend, and it is extending already to other technologies. Both of those platforms don't hold that kind of data. We do obviously hold asset data, contract lifecycle data, knowing where those contracts are starting and ending. No different to some of the ERP companies who probably hold a lot more data than we do, because the service management platforms typically hold the specific contract data that we're pushing relatively benign data into. So the most important thing with our platform is to glue all of this together and get the right data to the right place at the right time by feeding that data into those multiple systems and processes, making sure they reach the right place. So we push data into funders. Well, those funders have been working with the channel for a long time. The channel typically use a funder to capitalize what they're selling, and spread the cost of that to the customer over a period of time, sometimes reducing that cost significantly with the benefit of residual value, and some other things that we're now incorporating into the platforms. So those funders typically do engage directly with the customer because they're collecting on behalf of those partners. Certainly in the office equipment market, that's the case. So we enable those funders to do what they do. We enable distribution to aggregate and create a rate whilst remotely monitoring those devices more efficiently and effectively. So we're typically processing device-centric data and contract data and working with those third-party systems that are holding maybe data that would be more aligned to detailed commercial data or personal data.
Okay, and the point you mentioned about the e-commerce functionality, I'm just curious in terms of what your views are on how that would, or how Amazon is impacting the market generally, both on the print side and I suppose just general IT side, and how your platform fits in with those e-commerce capabilities that those companies are already using that are linked to Amazon.
So it's interesting. I mean, obviously Amazon has triggered a lot of the retail industry to put business online, and Amazon is very similar to a distributor in a way. They aggregate so much in one platform that it's very convenient to go to that one-stop shop. With the IT industry, you've obviously got the consumer side of that industry, and you've got the B2B side of that industry. So we're predominantly focused on the B2B commercial side of the technology industry and the printing and imaging industry as well. Although we do now have consumer solutions that are multi-brand that should enable the consumer part of that opportunity to start flowing through some of our platforms, courtesy of those e-commerce front ends that we're enabling. So if you look at the B2B e-commerce platforms used by the larger corporate resellers, systems integrators, and online e-shops, then we're finding that our role is to try and enable those partners to move away from selling transactional commodity at low margin to combining those solutions together so they can sell much more of a managed solution via a subscription that typically is more profitable. The cost components are far less visible, but ultimately the customer's getting a better deal anyway. So at this stage, we're finding that the activation of those existing e-commerce platforms is something that we're heavily involved with. In fact, I would say we're almost overwhelmed with doing that right now and having to grow the team to support that. But we're also involved with working with the smaller resellers who don't have their own e-commerce platform. So we've established a relationship with an organization that can very easily and quickly put together an e-commerce platform, either on a free of charge basis or start to charge at a very low cost for a degree of higher value capability within those platforms that they can expose to their customer. Now, at the moment, most of that channel is working to pull together a basket on behalf of that customer, then convert it onto a subscription, and then in some cases remotely manage that and proactively manage that environment throughout the duration of that contract. And our role also is to automate the lifecycle management of those contracts. So if you're looking to move the technology industry from selling products to the customer to manage, obviously they don't have a back office similar to the office equipment market that manages all of those devices on contract throughout the duration of that contract. And the usage and the servicing and the billing around that particular asset. So we've invested a lot in automating the lifecycle management so that you don't have to build a big back office. So it's not costly to move into everything as a service. And by so doing, we're finding that the combination of subscription, remote management, and e-commerce, putting everything online, is moving more in the direction of end user self-service. So they can literally, for a bundled commodity type solution, you might have a few laptops, Office 365, a printer device remotely managed, with some other service management capability in the mix for the entire environment. That might be a relatively fixed cost. So you can represent that on an e-commerce platform as a cost per month, cost per week, or cost per quarter, making it more affordable, where the end user can log in, they can enter their details, they can self-authorize, credit authorize themselves, which will generate the paperwork electronically. Within a few minutes, you've now got that customer on contract without having to invest a huge amount of sales cost into that process. And again, that's our goal, to enable that to happen across any technology, whilst reducing the cost of sale and increasing the profitability. And that's where the relentless innovation has to continue, so that we pull in more components and make it much easier and accommodate for any solution from any brand, and of course integrate those native services from those resellers as well, so they can add their unique value.
Yeah, I think you've raised some really interesting points there around the e-commerce integration with service management and remote monitoring, because we published a report last year called the Amazon Effect, and it's really interesting to see that, like you mentioned, the B2B procurement is moving online, and the way that the channel, the typical traditional print partner can protect their business is to actually have some e-commerce capabilities and actually build value on top of that, rather than otherwise you kind of potentially lose the customers to Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, we had back in 2002, I think it was, we had one of the ex-HP consulting managers join the business for a while. And he used a term that's resonated with all of us at the time and continues to, which is the value will always migrate to the periphery of the supply chain. And so what we're trying to do is enable that value to be at the periphery of the supply chain, manifest in an e-commerce platform to make it easy to do business with. And as the industry and information becomes more available, the commoditization process gets quicker and quicker. So again, our role is to try and protect the channel so that they're not commoditized, that we still manage to deliver exceptional value to the end user, making solutions more affordable whilst increasing that profitability, putting it on contract, and making sure that some of the inherent commercial figures that are involved with creating that ultimate monthly cost solution are not visible to the aren't visible to the Googles and the Amazons of this world. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that Amazon is the enemy. They're not. They're a great customer as well. But certainly they've established the de facto standard, I think, for making business easy and online. We're taking that further to make it generic. We've got mobile applications with micro stores, so you can easily reorder and recontract from a mobile device. So again, pulling all of those things together on behalf of the channel and enabling them to cross the chasm. Certainly the office equipment market has an opportunity to move over into broader IT services, on contract, which is where they're very strong. And in the meantime, as they build up their own value, then we're able, with the backing that we have now, to build solutions that can be drop shipped on their behalf ahead of them building their own capability.
Yeah, so I guess it's all about creating that frictionless customer experience that the channel really needs to do, not just for MPS, but IT services as well. So it's really interesting to hear that kind of journey that your company's been on. And I know we talked about MPS commoditization at the beginning. So what do you really think is perhaps next for the print industry in terms of the journey moving out from that commoditization to high value, moving up the value chain, and perhaps what are the challenges ahead for the industry as a whole?
The big dynamic that I think we're seeing is that the office equipment industry is looking to broaden its capability into broader workplace services, which, to be honest with you, is not dissimilar to what was office automation of the 70s. So they just need to shift their paradigm and embrace this digital environment, which is far bigger than the market that they're in today. And I think we're already seeing that happening, because what's also happening at the same time is decentralization. You're very familiar with the fact that there was a big push towards audit, assessment, and redesign, migrating pages onto centralized devices in open plan offices. More users sharing fewer devices now, producing more volume, requiring proactive service management. What we're seeing now is, obviously since the lockdowns, we've seen an acceleration of work from home, and therefore having to support much more distributed environments where the opportunity for profitability in those assets is lower. The volumes are actually getting higher. We're actually seeing more devices being remotely managed than we've ever seen. That's sharply increasing, even within single accounts that we're managing. We had one contract where they'd moved from 3,000 devices down to 1,000 devices, or fewer than 1,000 devices since 2010. They've now moved up to 5,000 devices with with several thousand workers going home, all having a device and an office environment set up at home. So that's decentralization is something we're seeing. And at the same time, we're seeing the IT industry embracing everything as a service, including printing and imaging devices too. We're also seeing some consolidation happening where you've got corporate resellers buying office equipment organizations, where the trend has historically been manufacturers buying some of those independents. We're seeing more of a trend towards the larger corporate resellers doing exactly the same thing. So there's a lot going on right now. We're right in the middle of it, supporting every part of the IT industry, all routes to market, whilst at the same time trying to help them all to move up that value curve.
And I think, there's been a lot of talk about NPS being dead and it's, not as relevant, but I think the point you mentioned there about the customer that's gone increase the number of devices, having centralized their device infrastructure before. It just seems that NPS is going full circle and organizations are now looking at more devices, maybe less pages through more devices. I don't know whether you'd agree with that in terms of the actual volumes, maybe still declining, but they're actually being spread across more devices.
It's a very interesting subject. So when we first saw the first lockdowns, we saw a huge drop in business. I mean, clearly for everybody, it was a very worrying time. And I did wonder what was going to happen to our business during that period. So I think it got to about May, and from the first lockdown, we continued to grow globally at 1% increments every week, which was interesting. I thought we'd be at least flat or potentially start seeing businesses close down, some of our customers disappear. That didn't really happen. What we did see though, by May, we saw a huge increase of about 14% in 1 month. We migrated several hundred new resellers over to our platforms in the US in 2021. And throughout the period, we've seen, yes, a reduction in volume. It's never fully recovered. We've seen volumes recover quite significantly from where they were in the first few months of the lockdown, but they've never really got back up to 100% or beyond that again. I think because most of the workers have changed the way that they operate. A lot more people are working from home. We have seen more devices show up at home. We've seen our whole installed base across over 100 countries now grow in terms of the number of devices. We've seen the volumes per device become much lower, but a factor that's also kicked in at the same time is we've seen the devices that are being made available at home are so low cost in terms of the ongoing monthly cost of the hardware, the consumables, and the support, that has become a much more back-end centric model. Therefore, you've got to have intelligent infrastructure to enable that. You can't be a hands-on managed service at the front end because that front end doesn't really exist anymore. So we've seen this shift to higher volume, lower value, remote service automation. And because of the cost point, we're seeing that the convenience factor is the reason people want their devices remotely managed. And they want them remotely managed in a consistent way, regardless of the brand. They don't want to be using a different solution every time, especially as we're seeing hybrid office with, sometimes a Surface Pro from Microsoft or a Dell, HP, Lenovo, whatever laptop, a different type of network environment. Pulling all of that together, regardless of brand, on a consistent, repeatable basis has become quite exciting for us because it's enabled us to get a broader view of what's going on internationally. And we're starting to see those trends are pretty consistent regardless of the region.
It's been really interesting to understand that kind of approach that you're taking in terms of service management, remote monitoring, and the actual distribution channel. So really appreciate you joining me today to provide some background, but also your thoughts on where the market's going. So I just wanted to finish with a final question, which I'm asking all the guests, which is not related to the print industry, but I just really wanted to ask you, what was your first job pre the print industry, and what advice or what lesson did you learn from that very first job?
Actually, prior to me having a full-time job, I was heavily into sports. So I was training 6 days a week, several hours a day. And to fund that, I did anything really, including cleaning a factory and then working as a service engineer. for a while for that factory organization. I think one of the things that I've certainly learned is that you treat people equally, regardless of their background. You don't judge people in terms of what they do or their status. You need to make society work by working with them, working with everybody equally. Everybody's got a role to play. I think that's certainly one thing I've learned. And also valuing people in terms of what they actually do. Everybody's got that part to play. I work with some incredible people. I couldn't have achieved some of the things that we have with the company if it wasn't for the expertise that we have. So I think valuing people and understanding what their role is and trying to make that work as a team, getting the right people with the right skill set, doing the right job. There's nothing better than seeing that all come together, and that's certainly one of the big lessons of my career, and that comes right from the first job I ever had, right through to today. It's great to see people working as a team, for sure.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we don't really appreciate until we actually take some time to think about our first jobs and how that really shaped our career and our behaviour in our roles. So that's really interesting to hear. So thanks ever so much again for joining me today. It's been a really interesting discussion.
Oh, thank you, Luella. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Yeah,
you're welcome, and look forward to speaking to you again in the near future. So thank you for joining today's episode of In the Spotlight with Quocirca. For more information, please go to quocirca.com and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in our next episode.